Well, I would say, let me think about that for a moment, being an introvert, thinking before I speak. I think the myth is that you may not have much to share. If you're not a very talkative person who's always contributing in meetings, and then someone says, "We think you should give the presentation," or you decide on your own, "I want to give a talk," the imposter syndrome whiplash, kickback that happens is, well, maybe I have nothing to say, or maybe I have nothing original to say. And that, of course, stops you cold. But as an introvert, you've thought about things and you have a unique view, a unique take on things. And that's what is worth sharing.
Hello, and welcome to episode 258 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts, along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we will air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review or a rating. That would mean a lot to me and help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Lee Schneider draws on a multi-decade career in storytelling, media making, and education to help architects, design professionals, and startup founders use storytelling to transform complex concepts into projects that get funded. For more than 10 years, he's taught a popular graduate level media making class at the University of Southern California School of Architecture. He teaches a master class about public speaking for introverts. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Lee. Lee, it's so good to have you on today.
It's great to be here.
We're going to get into the work you're doing, especially with introverts and public speaking. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about your journey to get to where you are now.
I was thinking about that today, and I really started as an avid teenage reader. I would read a couple of novels a week. In fact, my parents got me an account at the local bookstore, and one summer I spent $1,000
Oh, wow.
on novels, just paperbacks. And when you read that much, you start to think, you get ideas. Maybe I could write something equally as good or better. So I was interested in plays and novels and continually writing ideas for short stories. And I didn't focus on any one genre, but later I dialed in plays, screenplays, novels. And the best way to sell an idea like that is to actually go in person to pitch it. And that's very hard. That I realized how hard that was for me as an introvert. I would have to go into a room of boisterous writers or producers and try to hold down the room while I explained the screenplay I wanted to write or this TV show I wanted to do. But I realized the value of it. It put me in conflict. It definitely stressed me out, but it also was the best way to do it, better than sending in a script or something, a manuscript that would just be ignored and gather dust. So I came to this realization that storytelling, if you're going to sell the stories, if you're going to do it for a living, you're going to have to work through some of the cliches that people tend to apply to introverts, like you don't like people very much, or you don't know how to express yourself, or you're afraid of large groups. And all of that is not true. But as I began to work with those things, I realized, well, if you want to sell stories, you're just going to have to do some of that. And as I became successful at it and and got paid to do various kinds of storytelling, I've learned some of the patterns of what makes a good story. So that's put me where I am today, as I say, recovering television producer who is now teaching storytelling and presentation skills, as well as doing podcasts and writing novels and other forms of that. But for me, it's really been this journey of appreciating how to tell a story and then applying it to help other people realize their gifts in storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's going to be a part of our our story today as we're talking about public speaking. But you mentioned that you've written some novels. Tell us just a little bit about that.
Well, I have, like every novelist, I have a few novels in a drawer that will never come out. I
Okay.
wrote them, they were okay, but I couldn't find the traction. I finished them. I have a few unfinished ones too. But then I started writing what is now known as climate fiction. I got very interested in the issues around climate change, and I started noodling around on a story with I draw on pictures at first, I make diagrams. So I had a map kind of the story. And we had some fires here in California. I live in Southern California, and we couldn't go outside. And I'm a runner, couldn't run. And it kind of shook me up, and I realized my world is changing a lot. So I started writing. I've written a trilogy of three science fiction, climate fiction novels. And the last one came out about a month ago. And I'm starting a new trilogy, but I really like escaping into these fantasy worlds that I control. Sometimes I'll come to the dinner table and my wife and child will look at me and they see that kind of 1,000 mile stare and they say, "You're not really here yet, are you?" And I say, "Yeah, well, I'm arriving, but I'm still in my world of my characters."
Yeah.
So I've really enjoyed that kind of long form writing where you get to dig into a story and your reader too spends, a couple of weeks with the book. It's very gratifying when people like the books.
Yeah. And you know, I'm sure extroverts can be great writers too, but definitely it's a gift we have as introverts to go deep. We have good imaginations and we like using our imaginations, and so that's really a skill that we can have as an introvert. And also
Absolutely.
we enjoy reading the science fiction and other novels.
Right. I mean, think of it, a writer spends a lot of time alone. You can write in groups, and there is the phenomenon now of sort of the Zoom writers group where people will sign on to a Zoom and you'll just have your camera on and you can watch other people writing, or you can write in groups. But most of the time, you're in a world of your own construction and you're by yourself, and you don't want the interruptions. So, yeah, it's very well suited to the introvert mind, that's for sure.
Yeah. And we don't want to be alone all the time, but sometimes we do, and sometimes we need it. And it really can give it, be a gift for certain things like writing and other projects.
Sure.
So let's just start there. Like, when did you figure out you were an introvert?
I think it was probably at one or another office party. I used to work, I'm from New York, and I used to work in production in New York. And there were, we would be producing a news show or a cartoon, and I would, I was often a writer, sometimes a producer on those shows, and I really liked being in my office and writing the scripts, and I liked the one-on-one meetings, but I began to realize, wow, these big office parties are kind of a strain, and friends of mine who are more extrovert types would be, party hopping, like, let's do three in a night, and I would be, no, one and done, maybe two. And,
Yeah.
I never put a name to it, but that's probably when it occurred to me in that early work life.
Okay. What would you say is a strength you have because you're an introvert?
I would say focus, the ability to focus, be alone, and really dig into stuff. I like research. I like disappearing into things. When I was a news producer, I've worked for Dateline NBC and Good Morning America and local news and cable TV. And a lot of times in those positions, you just get thrown a thing. We want you to write something about undersea exploration. You're going to go out on a boat next week and we're going to, do deep sea photography. And it's like, okay. And then I would have to research that. Well, that as the introvert, I was like, let's dig in. It was kind of fun for me. I imagine an extrovert would tackle it differently. They might get on the phone and call or email a lot of people and ask questions, but I was very happy with like, give me a bunch of footage to review and log. And sure, I'll call some people and talk to people, but I like to prepare, which is another, I don't really like to wing it that much. And as an introvert, like enjoying preparation served me very well as a journalist because I could go into the interview or the production situation and know enough.
Yeah. And that's a key for us. Preparation, not only is it a strength, but it's a necessity. We're not always the best at thinking in our feet. And when I say that, I'd say we're not always because sometimes we come up with things on the spot, but often we do better with some preparation, whether it be for a speech or a presentation or something, we do better with some preparation. And it's a gift that we have too.
Yeah, to have the patience, you know, so much of life comes down to project management, whether it's, being a parent, being a worker, being a spouse. And part of that be preparation is project management. Like, what's the beginning, middle, and end of what you need to get done? It's more than a to-do list. It's kind of like a project flow. And as an introvert, I feel gifted in that because I can really sit down and break stuff down. I'm willing to do it. I don't want to go in, well, let's see what happens. I want to know what's going to happen. And in television production particularly, wow, there's a sentence that I can't say on this podcast, but
Okay.
it goes something
Yeah.
like assumption is the mother of messing up. And,
Yeah.
we learn never assume anything. Always have backups, always have a plan B, always know if someone didn't show up, what are you going to do about that? And I think being an introvert, it prepared me for that kind of thinking.
Yeah. And often it it makes a better speech. It makes a better presentation. And, like you said, I'm not that great at winging it either. That's not going to be the best for me.
Mhm. Well, it also helps to be a scenario builder, which is kind of gets into the storytelling ideas that we're kind of what if people. Like, what if I'm giving a talk, what if I forgot that part? Or what if I flipped these two parts? Or what if my slides went down and I didn't have slides? Well, it can be anxiety inducing, but it also can be just thinking through, all right, if my clicker's not going to work, well, I'll just figure out a way to do it differently. Or if I forget a part, the funny thing about public speaking is if you forget a sentence or two of your talk, no one's going to know. No one's sitting there with a transcript of what you're supposed to say. It's only in your head.
Right.
And I've found 99% of the time, if I drop a line, I usually pick it up. If I listen to myself later in a recording, I pick up that line elsewhere. The whole corpus makes it. It's just that I may not, in kind of an improvisatory mode, I may miss something, but that's not that important because I'm the only one who really notices.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think we might have busted some myths already, but is there any other introvert myths that you want to bust today?
I'm very interested in the difference between shyness and introversion. And for me, I know that's a big topic and one that you've covered on the show, but for me, it has a lot to do with if I have a function, if I have a job at a big, noisy event, I'm not shy. That doesn't even enter into the picture. If I am setting an intention, like I'm going to a networking event, or I'm going when I used to sell television shows, we'd go to what's known as a television market. It'd be a huge hotel filled with people pitching TV shows. And you just had to go up to people. And I could see as a shy person, I'd be paralyzed. But as an introvert with a strategy, I could say, I'm going to hand out 5 business cards this morning. That's all. Just hand out 5 or meet 5 new people in the context of pitching a TV show. You can do that. And I think that notion of kind of breaking out of our shell for limited purposes and for something that's important, we can do that. It's not off the table.
Yeah. And so it's not shyness. Introverts can be shy, but so can extroverts.
Yeah.
I know shy extroverts. And what shyness is, it just means you lack confidence in something, approaching somebody, approaching a situation. But, like you just said, there's some strategies you can develop. For me, I used to be shy, I used to lack confidence, and it was because I didn't understand that in general, as an introvert, I'm going to think first and then speak. I'm going to gather all my thoughts. I'm going to share what's most important, and that's how I operate. And good stuff comes from that. Because again, we have good imaginations, we come up with good solutions and different things. Extroverts think out loud most of the time.
Mm.
And, you know, this is probably the case for you, but I don't often share half-baked ideas. But the extrovert
Mm.
is not worried about that. They like to talk it out with other people, and they start with an idea that's not fully formed. And generally, we don't do that.
That's true. Well, here's a funny thing. I often talk into a recorder, whether on my watch, and that's my way of sharing half-baked ideas with myself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'll walk around and blab all these half-baked ideas out, and then I listen to them later and make sense of them. I'm going back to my early work experiences in big production environments. I remember someone saying, Lee doesn't speak up often in meetings, but when he does, we should listen to him. And that was true. I would get very kind of tongue-tied in a large group meeting, but if I really had something to contribute, I learned that it was worth it to do it, try.
Yeah, that's great. And that's where the name of the podcast came from. Somebody said something similar to me.
Hmm.
You're quiet and strong, meaning that I didn't talk a lot, which it's funny because in my mind, I've overcome shyness. I'm confident. I'm talking as much as I want to, but
Uh-huh.
I'm still not talking as much as an extrovert next to me. So the person said, you know, when you talk, people listen. And that's where the title of the podcast came from.
Oh,
And,
great.
you've experienced that. And, introverts, you can develop a reputation for having great ideas. And you can have a reputation. I may not be talking the most, but I am thinking and I have things to contribute.
Right. It's an interesting fact, and you've had some actors. There was a woman you had on who was a former actor now teaching
Yeah,
public speaking,
right.
and she brought up a great point, which I read independently a few days ago, that a lot of actors are introverts. You
Yeah.
think of them as the very demonstrative and, but they're in a role and they have lines and there's a lot of preparation involved. So it's actually a pretty good job for an introvert to be an actor.
Yeah. And you know, half the population are introverts,
Mm.
and probably half the out of actors, probably half, or it could even be more. And another myth that I bust is sometimes we do like to perform and be in the spotlights. Sometimes people say introverts don't like to be in the spotlight, and that I'm like, oh, that's not true. I love it. It just depends on the situation, but yeah, that's a good myth to bust that actors, I think a lot of comedians are introverts because they're really deep thinkers and
Mhm.
look at the world and see their own views in the world.
Mhm.
So, what's a myth around public speaking and introversion? Because I know that's something that you're doing now. You're teaching about public speaking and introversion.
Well, I would say, let me think about that for a moment, being an introvert,
Yes.
thinking before I speak. I think the myth is that you may not you have much to share. If you're not a very talkative person who's always contributing in meetings, and then someone says, we think you should give the presentation, or you decide on your own, I want to give a talk, the imposter syndrome whiplash, kickback that happens is, well, maybe I have nothing to say, or maybe I have nothing original to say. And that, of course, stops you cold. But as an introvert, you've thought about things and you have a unique view, a unique take on things. And that's what is worth sharing. So often, like as a novelist, I've learned, have people written books about the future before? Yeah, of course. Have people written books about AI before? Plenty, plenty of them. But my book about the future in AI is going to be my book. It's going to be unique. So there, and I'm going to put a lot into it. I'm going to think about it a lot. So it's going to have a unique view that's mine and presumably worth it for others. So I think it's kind of the imposter syndrome you can get pretty tangled up in that, especially if you think you have nothing unique to share. Like it's all been said before, when you hear that people's doubts come up. And maybe it almost has all been said before, but that shouldn't stop an introvert from sharing a fresh idea because it's from their perspective. So it's never been heard before.
Yeah, and another myth that we bust that goes along with this is that people say introverts don't have much to say. And like you're saying, sometimes people actually believe that as an introvert. But the truth is, we have a lot to say because we're always thinking. And
Right.
so our ideas, even though they may be similar, they can be fresh and new, and we need some new and fresh ideas.
Yeah. What helps people sometimes is this idea of journaling or more what are sometimes called morning pages, where you
Yes.
open a journal, or I have a digital one with a tough stylus, and I just write whatever comes to mind, even if I say I can't think of anything to write today, I make myself write about 4 pages worth of stuff. And it generally starts to aim into what I need to work on today, or the thing that I got stuck on, and I'll do that also if I have to give a talk, or I have to come up with a unique view of something, or write a scene in a novel. Sometimes just to free associate writing and kind of vaguely guide myself, but not too much, and just let it be loose like that. It's the extrovert's version of just kind of talking it out with another person and dialoguing. It can be really valuable, and it just uses another part of the brain. You're using your hand. It works better when you're using a handwritten device. Doesn't work as well if you're typing. It's just a neurological thing where you're going to tap into a different part of creative thinking when you're writing by hand. But I found that really helpful. And I mentioned earlier, sometimes I will go for a walk because walking definitely stimulates the mind, and just record myself talking at length about whatever I need to work on or whatever it might be, and then listening back to that or making a transcript. You can get pretty far with that if you get stuck on the usual ways of coming up with a fresh idea.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes that fresh idea comes when we're not trying to think of it.
Well, that's the old shower bit,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I've
Exactly.
known people who have waterproof pencils and pens and pads, and they literally write it down in the shower. But I would say about 75% of my mornings, I need to write something down as soon as I get out of the shower.
Yeah, yeah. My time is driving, like driving to work or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
where, have the space to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Lee, you said something a moment ago. You told me, let me think about that. That is such a good introvert strategy because sometimes we need a moment and we just need to tell people, hey,
Yeah,
give me a moment to think about that, or I will tell you tomorrow, whatever it is.
that's right. Well, for the past almost decade now, I've been a podcast producer and editor. So I've listened to a lot of conversations, and it's completely okay to pause while you think of something. It's fine. It can be edited out of a podcast or in a conversation. It's very natural. In fact, some of the best parts of the podcasts I've edited are when someone says, just let me think about that for a second. And I'll actually, as the editor, I'll leave the pause in, like that moment of someone going, hmm. It's a dramatic moment. And you can even use that in public speaking when you're giving a talk. If you pause to think of something, or pause for a moment before you say the most important thing or repeat the most important thing, it's very valuable. It kind of catches people for a moment. You're not just trying to fill every space or drone on, you wait for a moment. It also is a very good eraser. The comes because you're probably talking a little faster than you can think, or your mind is trying to change gears or change direction. But a pause is totally appropriate. And then you don't have to and you sound more articulate.
Yeah. And for some reason, we've been made to think that pause is bad, that silence is bad, but we need it. And like you did, we just need to ask for it sometimes.
Yeah. Well, go to I don't know if people are going to plays very often, but if you see a really good actor working or speaking the lines of a script in a movie or a play, look at the pauses, listen to the pauses next time. That's how they make it work. It's almost like a piece of music. There was a great Broadway actor that I directed for a voiceover in a documentary, and he wrote almost like a musical notation of his own design on the script that had the pauses and the line where he would wait, and he had just blocked that whole thing out in a very musical way that he could reproduce. And it included dramatic pauses that he put in because he knew they worked. He was a very experienced actor, for voiceover and in movies and stage, all of it.
Yeah. And as we're talking about public speaking, you're saying it's very powerful for public speaking sometimes just to
Yeah.
make a pause.
Yeah. Well, it's part of claiming the space. There's a big difference in being energetic and trying to sound excited and filling every moment with actually carrying the energy of sounding interested in what you're talking about and not getting all frenetic. You don't have to do this all the time to make people interested in what you're talking about. And you don't have to pace back and forth on the stage if you're doing that kind of presentation. You don't have to do that because it's distracting to the audience. It's very powerful when, if you're speaking or giving a presentation, if you stand and you don't, or sit, whatever you're doing, but you don't have to move so much. People are going to tune into you more and connect with you more. So my wife teaches public speaking for people who are building specifically TEDx talks and other kind of talks. And one of the first bits of advice she gives is stop pacing. You don't need to stalk around the stage to get people's attention. It's better to focus on people in the audience and connect with them.
Yeah, that's some great advice there. So, just in general, like, how would you define what makes a great speech?
You know, some of it is just good old storytelling where there's a beginning, middle, and an end. And to dig into that a little bit more, there's a setup and a payoff. At the beginning of every great talk, you make a promise. It may not be explicitly a promise, but you make a promise that you're going to educate today or you're going to entertain today. Something's going to happen. And you even may make a very bold statement that later you can pay off and deliver on. You mentioned comedians. A comedian will start often with an outrageous statement at the beginning, and then they somehow deliver it and make it work at the end. I recently began a keynote that I was giving with I'm an introvert, and it can be a challenge for me to get up and here to talk to all of you here. And that was my version of a bold statement in that context. And later at the end of the talk, I paid that off. I said, here's why being an introvert has actually helped me come to you and find some things in common that we can connect with. So it's what I refer to as a story arc. You don't want a flat line. You don't want to kind of go into a monotone. You want to make a promise and deliver on that promise. And sometimes, often that means educating people or enlightening people, not ending up in the same place that you started. That's kind of a bit abstract, but you'll see that a lot of great talks follow that pattern. There's a setup and a payoff.
Yeah. How how do introverts best prepare to give a speech or presentation? And in your mind, does that look different from the way an extrovert might?
Not sure about the differences, but I know that there are different ways of effectively preparing. What you need to do is embody the words in you. So you don't really need to refer to notes all that much. Now, the trick to that is practicing and not being afraid to practice too much, because you really can't practice too much. Some people might practice in front of a mirror. Some people might record themselves and listen back on a walk or something like that. But I find the single most important thing you can do is don't read it. Don't mumble actually memorize the first minute, maybe, or even the first 2 minutes, and really try to live that so you can speak that without, even if you leave out a sentence or occasionally, that you can really embody that. So for me, practice is actually delivering the talk aloud. And before you give it, deliver it to one person, maybe two, but a real person, whether it's a spouse, a friend, find somebody, because if it's going to feel very different to see another person reacting as you give that talk. It's just going to be different from doing it in your den or your bedroom or wherever you're doing it. So there are different practice strategies and different memorization strategies. I haven't asked an extrovert about their how they would do that differently. I imagine they'd be more willing to see the value in talking it out to another person, and probably more willing to wing it a little bit
Yes.
more.
Yeah, that's
Which
for
is,
sure.
you know, I do believe in a bit of fun improvisation, but I do even more strongly believe in memorize the first minute or two, because that's when the audience really needs to connect with you. And for goodness sake, land it. Memorize the last page or the last paragraph. So you can really kind of do that dramatic thing of put the notes aside or just talk to people. It can be very powerful. If your face is in your notes the whole time, it's not going to work. But if you have to check your notes in the middle of a talk, depending on how long, so what? I mean, people check their notes. It's okay. I recently gave the talk that I gave. I decided on index cards, and I kind of put the index card down on the table, each one that I finished. I didn't need to stare at the index cards. I had kind of talking points, but I really made a point of that kind of set up and payoff structure of first, let's speak the first minute fluidly from memory, and definitely speak the last minute or so fluidly from memory, because that's what people remember. They want to remember that last closing line.
Yeah, I think that's powerful, the beginning and end. So what else do you do there? Do you just kind of create an outline?
I've done it, so many different ways. It kind of depends on the talk. You can use Zoom and other platforms, if you're doing that, they have what's the old teleprompter, which is what pros use, where you can actually look right at the camera, but the words are up there. That doesn't work for me because I kind of get that staring look when I'm reading the words. So I often will type out a script and then write out just about every word that I'm going to say, and then kind of toss that away and make an outline that prompts me to remember what I need to say. I often will have a structure that I'm working from. I try not to depend on cards or a deck because there's a trap that you can easily get into, kind of a PowerPointitis, where you start saying everything that's on your deck and people start reading your speech as you're speaking it because everything you're saying is a bullet point, and you giving a collection of bullet points and calling it a speech is actually what most people do if they're not experienced, but it's not that interesting really. You'd rather maybe have a couple of points that are key points, or maybe even a picture or something that's evocative, and speak around that, because you don't want people reading ahead literally to your PowerPoint and looking at your points. That it makes they stop listening to you. And what makes it great is that you're talking to them. It's that human to human connection, which is what makes it so powerful and fun. So some of it is the way you memorize and how you memorize is the best way to deliver it.
Yeah. So how do you decide when to use a PowerPoint and when not?
I find I need it almost always is if the talk is longer than 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
And I don't use it as a roadmap. I use it as kind of an outline for myself. and I use it to emphasize key points that I want people to remember so I can even kind of point at it sometimes and, reference it. On the other hand, for about 10, 11 years now, I've taught a 15-part course for the University of Southern California, and it's an hour and a half to 2 hours each lecture. And by now, I know that pretty well. I have a script and I have notes, but I can basically just speak that out. So I don't really need the script anymore. And sometimes I'm horrified to see that I dropped a section or I brought a section up out of order. But basically, since that's so much part of me now, and I've given that talk so often, I don't really need any written material any longer, even though I might have it as a backup just in case.
Yeah, and sometimes it might be nice, like you said, there might be a picture or something that really adds to the speech.
Yeah, I mean, I like joke pictures sometimes or things that people don't expect. Like when if I give a talk about lighting lighting a scene in a movie, and I'll say, there's a source of lighting that's free, and I'll have a picture of the sun, and it gets a chuckle, and it makes the point though that you can use natural lighting sometimes, and so yeah, pictures are usually more powerful than a PowerPoint filled with bullet points.
Yeah, yeah. And then what do you say, Lee, to the person that lacks confidence in giving a speech, especially introverts? How can they gain confidence in their speaking abilities?
I like in this context to go deep, to think about your real motivations for why you are there. There's a consultant named Simon Sinek who gave a TED talk called The Power of Why. And that why, the capital WHY, thinking about why you're really there. What's your motivation? What really matters to you? And I will be when I'm planning a talk or when I'm getting ready to go up in front of the audience to do it, I revisit that. I ask myself, why am I here? What do I want people to take away from this talk today? That's working from the inside out. Now, the opposite, working from the outside in, is if you can get into the room where you're going to give that talk a day before, a minute before, an hour before, a week before, if you can just stand in that spot, the podium or at the table, and just look out over the imaginary audience, it's an amazingly empowering thing to do. I've done that almost every time I've given a talk. I try to arrive early, or if I can be there, even if it's a place in the office, and there's a conference room. I need to give the talk there, just to be there, embody it. Know, like, oh, there's where I plug in the computer, or here's how the audio visual gizmo works, or there's going to be a chair or there won't be a chair. All of that stuff from working from the outside in is very powerful. But I think both approaches, inside to out and outside to in, work together very well.
Yeah. And that going to the place ahead of time, it's part of our preparation. And it also
Sure.
can take away a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, definitely. And doing a little tech run through, if you have any tech stuff that you're going to have to deal with, well, try it. Try your deck. Does the deck work on Zoom? I've gotten in the habit of carrying the connecting cables I need to hook my laptop up to anything.
Yeah, that's
So,
good. That's good.
so if you show up and there's a big, huge screen and someone says, well, we forgot the connector, I'll say, well, I have one in my bag.
Yeah. So you've been involved with podcasts. How are podcasts a really good way for introverts to share their ideas?
I love podcasts as a rehearsal for thinking out loud. Dialogue. Dialogue, the core of a podcast is a conversation for most. And you get to dialogue out your ideas. Someone's going to ask you questions and you've maybe rehearsed the answers, but I like the way a podcast takes you a little bit into your edge. Like you've asked me questions that I might not have framed exactly the way that I thought about them 2 hours ago when I was thinking about this. But
Right.
that's good. that's great, because if I do another podcast, I will have covered some of that territory. So I happen to love and by the way, it doesn't have to be a video podcast. It can be great just to talk to people, just to have a great conversation. I find when I produce a podcast and I read the introduction to the guest, I'm pretty bad at reading it into the camera, like trying to read like a newscaster. I sometimes have to use those if I'm doing a YouTube production, but boy, do I like reading into a microphone. I feel like I do so much better that I don't have to deal with the way I look or, if I make a funny face or whatever it is about you know, the the camera part of this. So I'd say podcasts are great it's high value, but low stress way of getting your ideas out there.
Yeah, yeah. So this has been a good podcast episode. Is there anything else that you'd like to add today, Lee?
No, I think you were really thorough. Like I said, you took me to some good edge places, which is,
Good.
really, really valuable.
Yeah, this has been a wonderful conversation. Where can
Excellent.
people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Well, redcupagency.com is my education and production company, like a Red Cup agency. And that is where you'll learn about what I call the storyline sessions. And I'm starting a storyline sessions edition for introverts to help introverts be better public speakers. And if you're interested in novels and fiction, my other life, leeschneiderbooks.com has all the information about the books that I'm writing.
All right, sounds great. Thanks again, Lee.
You got it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the four-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.